Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture of CC 111. Today's topic is methods in Python. In our last lecture, we have learned about different type of variables. One is instance variable and another was static or class variable. In today's lecture, we are going to learn about the different types of method that we can define in Python. There are three methods, so basically we are going to learn about those three. One is called instant methods, another is class methods, and the last one is static methods. So we'll discuss about all these three methods in this lecture. First of all, instance methods. Instance method is something that we already know from the beginning of the class definition. The class itself in Python is consist of attributes and methods. So one of the known method to us is the instant methods that are similar to the functions that we have learned so far. In instance method is the most common type of methods. These methods are used to access the data of the instances or objects. So these methods are one of the important methods that will provide us the facility to accessing the data that the objects will have. This methods does not require any kind of decorator. Okay, this decorator means we don't need anything kind of tagline, something that we need to define in Python so that it will treat the method as an instant method. So there is no need of any decorator. We'll see the rest of the two methods will require to have this decorators. One of the things that this kind of methods, the instance methods required, is to have an instance created. So first, to call these methods, we need to have an object of this class. Okay, so this is what we call a class instance. So without having an instance of a particular class, we cannot call any instance method. Also, there is a requirement of having the self parameter. Okay, so this self parameter is basically the class instance reference that we need to pass inside our instance method as a parameter. Otherwise, we won't be able to execute that method. So in this right hand side of this slide, we have a class student defined, where we have a constructor and we have an instance method defined. So basically we are creating a definition def print detail self as a parameter and just printing the names. Okay, so this is how we define an instance method, and how we call it by using the reference object. So in our tester part, we have an object called st1 created using this class student constructor, where we have passed Alice as the name and ID as 150125541. Later on, we have called the instance method using this reference st1 dot print detail. So the output of this code will be Alice has ID 1512541, which is written in this method. So this is how we call instance method. So I suppose you guys already know about the instance method. So we'll move to another type of methods, and we'll see a kind of combine example later on, so that we can identify between different type of methods. The next one is a static method. What is a static method? We have already learned about static variables, or what we can call them also class variables. So static methods are kind of similar concept like static variables. That static means that are independent of objects, so that belongs to the class. they are related to the class, so they cannot access to instance object data, or we can say it cannot modify any instance or objects specific data. Okay. Static methods by itself, when we define it, is required to have a decorator, which is written as @static method. When we add this decorator in our class structure, Python will treat the below method as a static method. Without this decorator, it won't be treated as a static method. Okay, so we'll need this static method. It won't require any kind of parameter, like in our instance method we are required to have self, and we'll see we'll need something called CLS for class methods. So this kind of parameter we don't need it in static methods. Also, we don't need any class instance here. We can call this method without having any objects created, like in static variables, as these are independent of objects or instances. We can just call it by using the class name, as this static variables says. So basically they are used for utility functions, such as we want to print something, or we want to do some kind of required operations that are independent about of the object, so we can use the statics. So here we have a simple example where I have a static method defined using an @static method decorator. Then we use define static method, empty bracket usually is empty. Okay. Then we have the print statement. This is a static method, so we can call it by using the class name. So if you look at the tester point, we have the student.static method. This will give me the below the following output. This is a static method which is written in the inside the method definition. So this is everything about a static method. Let's see the next method. The next method is class methods. So class methods are kind of bounded to the class but not to the objects, similar to the static concept, but there are kind of differences. The first difference is that it cannot access a specific instance data, similar to the static objects, that we cannot access to individual objects data. It don't require to have self, but it required to have another parameter, which is CLS, which stands for class. So we need to define the class reference when we pass as a parameter inside the method. So for passing the class reference, we have to use CLS when we define a class method. Also, it is important to have the decorator, which is @class method, when we define a method which will be used as a class method. These class methods can modify any class state, but not the instance state. So we can change the variables, the class variables that are defined in the class using this method, but we won't be able to change any object specific data. Okay. And also inside the class method we can call another methods that are statics. So in this example that we have here, in the class student we have a static method and we have a class method. Inside the class method we have called the static method. For that we have to use the CLS that we have passed as a parameter in the method to call this static method. So CLS dot static method bracket will call this static method. that is defined inside the class. So we can do that. For defining the class method, we have to use this decorator @class method. Okay, this one. And for definition, define class method, then we pass the CLS, and here we do all the tasks. And for calling this method, we will need an object. So how we can have it? We define an object like st1, then we have this constructor to create the object, and for calling it we just refer to st1 dot class method. This will give me the following output. Okay, so that's all about class method. Let's take a look to an example. Okay, so let's take a look to this example. So we have a class here already defined on the student class, which has some variables on it. We have a static variable which is the student num. This is the similar example that we have seen already in our static variables. And here we have a constructor with 3 instance variables: name, ID, and department. And inside a constructor we have a print statement so that we can actually see the objects that we have created. So first I am going to create some objects. So st1, for example, is the first object. I will give some names. Let's add Alice. The ID is something like this, and the department is CSC. Another student, st2 equals to student, and let's say Bob. These are some generic names that I'm using for the example. Okay, so also the department is CSC. Let's run this. Okay, Alice object is created and Bob object is created. Okay, so we have already this object. So first of all, I'm going to show you the instance variables. As we have already seen some definitions of the instance variables, we already know the instance variables are variables that don't require to have any kind of decorator. So we don't need to define anything for Python to understand this is the instance variables. So let's define a very simple instance variable method, and we call it like instance method, and I'm gonna pass self here, as it is a required for instance method to have the self keyword. Okay, inside this method I'm gonna print the name of the particular objects or the IDs and all the information that we want. So let's print self dot name comma with ID, self dot ID, and department comma self dot department. Okay, so this will basically print all the information about the objects that I want. So let's call this method by using the reference of the object instance method. Okay, so if we run this, it will print me all the information of the first object with the name is Alice, the ID is this one, and the department is CSC. So instance method are the common type of methods that we have been seeing so far, where we have to pass the self keyword inside the method. We don't need any decorator, and we can access to the instance variables. Okay, so now we know already what is the instance method, where we can modify the parameters that are specific to the objects. Let's look at the another method, which is the static method. Okay. For defining an static method, we need to use the decorator static method. Okay. So the method that I'm gonna write here, it will be an static method that I have already mentioned using the decorator. So let's define it's the st method. Okay, and we don't need to pass any self or any kind of variables here, so it usually is empty. And here I'm gonna print something like uh, this is a static method. Okay, so in the previous example, when we have called the instance methods, we were required to have an object created. Either it can be st1 which is created, or either it can be st2. However, we cannot call it with the class name. If I try to do this, it won't work, because it's a missing one required prepositional argument, which is the self. Okay, so this cannot be done because the instance methods are particular to the object, so it's specific to the instances. It required to have an instance so that it can be called. But static methods are not dependent to the objects, these are belonging to the class, so we can easily call them without having any instances itself. So let's say I can comment this objects, still I can call this method. Okay, so it gives me the output as if this is a static method, so is won't required any instance. The thing is that in the static methods we can not modify any instance data, but we can do kind of functions that is required to do independent to the object. So basically we use these methods for such printing information, or kind of utility function for checking something, kind of error or something, so use the static methods. Okay, the next one is the class method. Let's define a class method here. For defining a class method, we have to use the class method decorator. Let's say CL method. Here we have to pass CLS, similar to the instance method where we are passing self. Here we have to pass CLS referring to the class itself, and we can print this is a class method. Okay, and how we can call it? Similarly, we can call it using the class name, same as the static. The properties are more or less similar. The difference between the static and class method is that inside the class method we can modify the class variables, but we cannot change the object's variables. So we can call this without having an instance. Okay, so we call it by using the class name, which is the student. Also, it is possible to call them using object reference. So you can call this is st1 cl method. This can also be done. It will give me the same output. Okay, we can do that for static methods as well. However, there is a little bit of difference when we do that. Basically is about the modification, as we say, or as I have already mentioned, that we cannot modify the variables inside the static method, but we can do it inside the class method. So for example, if I want to change the student name value to 100, we can do something like this. Okay, so cls dot student num equals to 100, but in a static method we won't be able to do this. Student num equals to 120. Okay, let's try this. A student cl method, and I'm going to print the student name after each calling. Okay, so as you see, after doing this inside the class, this is changed for everyone. Here student.name is changed as 100. So if I print this after calling the class method, it gives me 100. I do the same stuff in a static method and I change this to 120, but when I print the number after calling this method, it is still 100. So this change is actually not doing it. So we cannot modify the variables inside the static method. We can just view it, but we cannot modify that. But we can do modify the class variables inside class methods. That will be affected for everyone. Let's print it using an object, and we'll get the same number for all. Okay, this is also 100. Another thing that it can be done inside the class method is calling the static methods. So you can call cls.st method. This can also be done. So any kind of static methods can be called inside and static method. So I'm going to comment this. Let's comment out static methods. Okay, so now I run it. This is also calling the static method, which is called inside the class method. Okay, so this is all about static instance and class methods. In our next class, we will learn about inheritance. Thank you.